Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andy Scerri, and I'm here to moderate the panel Pursuing the Good Life, Nature, Demography and Politics. Our speakers today, there's been a substitution. David Goodhart, as you know, couldn't make it. But we have with us Ian Marcus Corbin, philosopher at Harvard Medical School and a senior fellow at Capita, think tank. José Alberto Garibaldi, director of the Energeia network and the lead of Learning by Doing initiative. We have Tobias Phibbs, deputy director, the Common Good Foundation, and head of talent and community at Civic Future. We have also speaker Vidal Romero. Vidal is a professor of political science at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, co-director of the Center for the Study of Security, Intelligence and Governance. And last but not least, Tobias Phibbs, did I already mention? Yes. Yep. Robin Grove White, emeritus professor, University of Lancaster. He's sat on several government commissions and is also a former chairman of Greenpeace UK. So I'd like you to welcome the speakers. I'll keep you to about 8 minutes using my smartphone and with the Wi-Fi turned off. So yes, I look forward to the contributions today, as I know you do. So let's take it in order as it appears in the program. Ian, José, Vidal, Tobias, and Robin.
Well, first of all, thanks so much to Adrian for the invitation and to all the organizers. This has been a pretty great couple of days for me, so thanks, and it's been wonderful to meet a number of you. So we heard earlier today, rightly, that there's something that we could call a baby bust throughout almost all of the wealthy world. The one exception being the State of Israel, which we can talk about in due course, which is an interesting exception. So we know a couple of things about this baby bust. One is that it doesn't really seem that it can be fixed yet by technocratic tinkering. Right? We've yet to find policy fixes that can make people have more babies. It doesn't seem to be correlated with the availability of generous services for young parents or young children. So we're left with a bit of a puzzle. So why are people throughout the wealthy world choosing not to participate in continuing the human species? So October of 2023, my friend and colleague Rick Weisbord, who's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, published a study finding that 58% of young adults in America report having no meaning or purpose in their lives. So I want to suggest that this is not an accident, that the generations that are refraining from participating in the continuation of the human species are also the generations that report having no meaning or purpose in their lives. So I suspect that the causality runs multiple directions. So for instance, I think that having a child, you know, that inflection moment of having a child come into the world and then the long process of raising a child is a real source for a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. But I want to focus today on the other potential direction of causality. The idea that a lack of meaning and purpose makes reproduction not make all that much sense. Okay, so to get into this a little bit, I want to say a few words about human cognition and how we make meaning and purpose in our lives. Okay, so I want to suggest that maybe the main genius of human cognition is its holism in a couple of senses. So for one, I'm looking out at you all right now. I'm understanding my situation, I'm trying to act well within it, based on a truly miraculous quantity of information, right? So as I do this right now, I'm bringing to bear so much from my own personal history, from my enculturation, my academic training, experiences as a child, my biological realities, my hopes for the future, the sense of the kind of man I want to be, what I hope you will take from this, and all of this comes to this amazing focal point in an act, right? You see a simple act happening in front of you. That much is uncontroversial, I think. I think we all understand that there's that sort of holism that is a primary marker of human cognition and action. There's another kind that Philip Blond, who's departed now, from us at least, we hope that's all, that he talked about today in terms of a sort of encounter with the universal. So I want to suggest that Philip is right, that not only right now am I calibrating my understanding of the situation and my actions within it, by synthesizing all these things that have happened to me and that I know, but I'm also bringing to bear some sort of sense of my cosmic situation, right? What are the origins of my being? Where am I headed? What is the great human story? Okay, so this seems to me, true, and it seems to me not to have ceased being true even for the younger generations who report this lack of meaning and purpose in their lives. I think even this cosmic wholeness, or this cosmic holism, is still very much a part of how they cognize their self and their world. But I want to suggest that the holism available to them is one that does not allow for the production of meaning and purpose. And that's because the kind of deep sources that are available to a lot of people in Gen Z and younger millennials are sources from which no human could be unalienated, right? They're sources that we cannot be close to. So I mean this in a couple of senses. One, I think that there's a picture of the cosmos available to them that is intrinsically alienating. So how many people here are familiar with the philosopher Hans Jonas? Oh, good. That's pretty good, actually. In the States, it wouldn't be so many. So Hans Jonas is a German-Jewish philosopher, studied with Martin Heidegger, classmate of Hannah Arendt and Leo Strauss. So he argues that humans can make their peace with a lot of different cosmic visions, a lot of different visions of the natural world. So we can make our peace for sure with a picture of the cosmos as one that is sort of animated by forces that are benevolent to us. Right, that one's pretty easy. He thinks we can also make a way in the world and have a sense of meaning and purpose and who we are and what's important for us in a cosmos that is animated by a capricious force that sometimes is against us and sometimes for us, right? Or even one that's animated by an essentially hostile deity, right? He thinks we can make a world there for ourselves. What he says is the true abyss, and something that has been rarely encountered in the human story, is the idea of a cosmos that is utterly evacuated of any will, right? That has no desire, has no feeling towards us, with whom we cannot interact in any sort of intersubjective way. And he thinks that that sort of abyss amounts to a kind of nihilism that ended up, in the case of his teacher, occasioning a really catastrophic moral and political failing when Heidegger was open to allying with the Nazi Party. And this sort of picture of the cosmos, I think, is exactly, and I won't be, I think, on unfriendly territory if I say this here, is exactly what comes out of the sort of mechanistic picture of nature, right? It's not something that we can interact with intersubjectively. So we're cut off from this really important sort of source of who we are and what we're to do here. Okay, the second sort of alienation is more particular. So I've spent a lot of time in Uganda the past couple of years, and I've been really struck by the degree to which Ugandans understand themselves in their day-to-day lives, in their health and well-being, in all sorts of facets, vis-a-vis their relationship with their ancestors, right? For a Ugandan, it wouldn't make sense to say that they are perfectly healthy if they are out of sync with their ancestors, if they've not been fulfilling their duties to their ancestors, right? If they're behaving in a way that could shame or dishonor their ancestors. And I think that for the generations of at least young Americans I'm talking about, that access to ancestors has been cut off in important ways, right? They become alienated from the lineages that produced them. Right, so I've heard students, talking about the men who stormed the beach in Normandy, and say, yeah, but they were a bunch of racists, right? There's a version of kind of progress-based liberal morality that can call me good. I can call myself good only because I am less benighted than the people who came before me, right? And there's a version of this where the people who lie in my lineage are primarily to be run away from, right? To be escaped from morally. So I think both of these sort of alienations are pretty devastating for our ability to understand who we are and where we're to go. If I don't understand my deep sources, it's difficult to understand what are my deep destinies. Where should I go? What should I be? That sort of stuff. Now, I think neither of these is right, and I think a little bit of kind of deep sustained attention to either of these topics would show that neither of these alienations is right. But I think there's an important force here that prevents young people from being able to confront these things directly, and that is the lack of solitude in their lives. Right? I think that largely through technological sort of gimmickry, a lot of people, let's say under the age of 40, basically, the experience of deep, sustained solitude and confrontation with nature, confrontation with their history and themselves is an entirely too rare commodity. And if that happens, it's difficult to understand who I am, why I'm good, and why I might want to make more of this to continue into the future. I'll leave it there.
Okay, José.
Thank you, Andy and Ian. We met before at lunch, trying to see how we were going to join up all these words in a sense, something that would make sense in the panel. And I think that maybe the point that I would like to emphasize is the part of meaning. And maybe the 2 points, one is, you see, I come from Energeia, and there's learning by doing, and maybe there's something in those words that, because Energeia has this Aristotelian tradition, is the preference for the actual, what you find in front of you. But it's also the idea of not abandoning purpose nor meaning. And learning by doing has this kind of embodied empirical sense. How can we advance something without saying that we already know all the answers, but trying to find out more of that? And then also, how can we tell this with stories? Because I think that the previous panel focused on this idea of stories. So what we're trying to do is to see how can we change the narrative about nature, and particularly about climate, by changing the stories. So we tell a different story. And I think this is important because otherwise, if we just focus on emissions, we focus on impacts, it's not really something that moves the spirit a lot, so to speak. Impacts kind of dooms you, and emissions is a rather technical thing. So maybe the point could be, how do we frame this discussion about a good life? And a good life has a long tradition, and I tried at the beginning to see how could we characterize this idea of a good life, something that provides meaning. And I said in a context of climate, we could use certain elements, not as a sense of this completes the understanding of the thing, nor that it's nothing that we cannot continue learning about, but it's actual. So I tried to say, A, that we have an element of relations, how do we live with others? B, how we are creative, and we create with others and with nature. C, how do we contemplate? Because it's not only how do we manipulate, but how do we understand and how do we contemplate other things that are beyond us. And finally, a sense of agency, and how do we organize ourselves to deliver that. May I also say that these aspects, these aspirations, are all of them low carbon, and they're all of them resilient. So what I'm aspiring to already has the objective I'm looking for at the end. Again, an Aristotelian approach to things. Now, if that was the case, and we want to advance in that direction, I think this also has implications as to how do we act in places and with communities. And it also has a sense of a spiritual aspect to it. It does not preclude a clear understanding of the numerical or the instrumental rationality, but it puts them in a different categorization. The story goes first, and the analysis goes underneath. So what is that we want to say with this kind of approach? First, there has been, and again, in the morning, there was this thing about the resourcement, how do we return to sources? And I remember, if you start reading, you know, remember this phrase, think globally, act locally, that was created by a Frenchman, René Dubois. And he was, besides being a molecular biologist, he was a theologian in a sense. And he tried to compare these two different approaches to places and to nature. He said you could have a Franciscan approach or a Benedictine one. The Franciscan sees something there, doesn't want to touch it. The Benedictine sees it and wants to make it better. How can it flourish? The community and the place. Am I saying that we should be monastics? No, but we can kind of use that as a metaphor, a sort of analogy. How can we create a place that improves the place but also improves the community? And if we start seeing it from that perspective, maybe the way we think about problems will start changing. I'm not saying that we should not start addressing issues of emissions, issues of technical support to make this thing possible, nor issues of economics or politics. I'm saying that we are understanding this in a different manner. In the morning, they were asked, they say that there is a moral imperative to grow. Well, if you just take this as an indication that we should have more cars, more TVs, more, I don't see how is that compatible with a sort of control of the emissions, but on the other hand, we also have something to address, how do we, but I think if you focus on the good life, then it's a different story. Because rather than having more cars, maybe you can start having better public transport. Rather than have a multiplication of private education, maybe better public education. And then you're shifting the way in which development moves. Again, our discussion in the morning about the left conservatism combines aspects of both sides. And I think this is a good thing to do because it changes, it allows places to speak, so to speak. It says, what in this peculiar place and with these particular communities, how do we act? And how do we approach to something? We've done this sort of discussion in maybe 4 or 5 countries and a large groups of countries. People, what they say, what do they bothers you? Security, rule of law, how this thing works, and then emissions. So if you address all the other things, then you can also address emissions, you can also address impacts, you can also address climate. But it's a kind of combined thing. I remember talking to some Polish colleagues that said that this is the same that is in Laudato Si, the papal encyclical. And I think there's something of that going on. Then on politics, I think that this has an element of how do we address specific issues within the climate debate, but also within national politics that reframes the debate. It paints it as something that we're looking for, but in a way that addresses both elements of the right, elements of the left, and liberal elements, because this must be done with a sort of liberality. It cannot be imposed. That's what I'm saying, that it is a learning by doing thing. But it also has an element of international relations, so to speak. We were seeing in the morning this discussion, yesterday, because the stories that you tell also are important. I've been in this in the multilateral thing for more years than it would be sensible to say. But I do remember before Paris, how was Paris achieved? Because it was a sort of miraculous thing. And it was a coalition of groups of very diverse countries. There were the Europeans, the Latins, islands, poor countries, and a bunch of kind of disoriented Africans cornering the Chinese and the Indians and trying to get the Americans on board. And this thing, what everybody contributed to that was a sort of gift economy. I'll give you this, that will give that, and everybody will contribute whatever they had. Again, an Aristotelian approach to things. And it worked, but it required imagination, It required a sort of universal objective, which has specific elements underneath. So it's combining both the universal and the practical. But then, if you see now what is happening, it's supposed to be that it's an issue of money. But if it's an issue of money, then nothing will be sorted out until you get the money, which is the perfect solution for a catastrophe. If you start focusing on money, and I remember again before Paris came, there was a meeting in Cancun in which Mexico, tooth and nails, resisted having a discussion on money before you have, it's like, give me money and I will see what I can do. No, first we see what we can do and then you give me the money. Or then we not you give me, we also find the money. And I think this is the sort of thing that we need to start returning to. It's coalitions of groups of countries or groups of people or group of communities that want to achieve something together and each one contribute different things. It is not impossible to do. Right now we have a kind of counterattack by the oil-producing countries. This thing about the money is it will put, of course, the developed countries on the losing end if there's no agreement, and a kind of paralysis due to war. So I think that, again, what we need to do is to have new stories. And these new stories have to be predicated not only in terms of power and not only in terms of capacity, but also in terms of moral suasion. If you are not the UK or you are not the US, you're a middle-income country, it's very important to have a sort of rule of law internationally to be able to deliver things. And I think that is also a valuable aspect of this discussion and of this capacity to tell joint stories that mobilize people and join us up into a different future. Thank you very much.
Vidal?
Thank you. Well, thanks so much to all the organizers for the invitation. I'm going to sort of continue with what José was telling you, but one level down, more on the implementation of the ideas of the good life to the climate change, to actually, well, not solving, because we're not going to solve it, but mitigating climate change. And the idea is I'm going to talk about two very specific things. One has to do with communal life, or the importance of the local, and also about hope as tools to try to solve this problem. And it will work to see the relevance and the usefulness of this, but also on the limits and some warnings about how far this can actually get when we try to put it into action. As José was telling you, there are certain elements or certain characteristics of the good life that we think are useful and desirable to solve this kind of problems. We started thinking about mitigating climate change in this Learning by Doing project from a very traditional political economy approach. There is a problem, let's say climate change. We know some good solutions. Technically, we know what to do. We need to change to renewable energy, stop consuming so much plastic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know the solutions, yet we do not implement them. So that's a typical political economy problem. So the question is, why? We usually blame, obviously, politicians. They're the main billions always. There are also bad incentives for the people who has to do certain things and they don't want to. So then there are no sufficient incentives. And the solution, so the traditional solution has to do with taxes, subsidies, or compensations to losers in this massive change that we have to do. However, these are not implemented or they don't work as are supposed to work in the real world. So we try to start thinking and trying to imagine solutions. And then came this idea from José of the good life. And we are we have been working on this for more than 2 years, almost 3 years on this. So we have been able to think, we have been able to conduct some survey experiments. Next step will be to implement some of these things. So we have figured out what is promising in terms of working. First, the emphasis on the local. Not just as an ethical principle of respecting local cultures or local practices, but also, and very importantly, about thinking of this communal, we will call communal self-interest. That is, if your community is going to be either flooded or is going to burn because you live in the woods or something else, it is the community who has the main interest in that things go well in terms of climate change, and also in fighting whatever happens, either the flooding or the fire. However, in most countries, not all local communities have sufficient resources to prevent flooding or to stop fire. It is usually either a bigger authority, like a state or a county, or national authority who has the resources and the know-how how to do these things. And there are good economic reasons for this. It has to do with economies of scale. It would be very expensive and very inefficient that every community would have sufficient fire equipment locally. But as climate change is getting worse and worse, we have to question this kind of approach to preventing and solving these kind of issues. So we look at the local, and we found all these principles of communitarism, the interaction between people, and the need to decentralize many of these decisions. We have conducted some surveys, and people, for instance, think that it is more likely that something would happen in the planet. Obviously, they think something is going to happen in the planet, something bad. Less so in my country, less so in my town, and only like 30% would think that they would suffer something. So something is wrong here. Just the numbers don't match, right? And it has to do a lot with information, but it also has to do with some cognitive biases that we have against bad things happening to me. They will happen to someone else, so this is not my problem. So this is a clear disincentive for action on climate. This is one of the things that we are trying to figure out how to do. Or think on how we have approached, or someone's have approached the problem. We think about climate change, or some people think about climate change, as that something is going to happen to the planet. And we are very, very bad with nature, and we are very bad with the planet. We're going to destroy it, and the like. But that's not true. I mean, even if we disappear because of global warming, the planet is going to be here for millions of years until it naturally disappears. And Cambridge is going to be covered by nature at some point, 100 years, 200 years. Humans are not going to be here. So this is really a problem that we humans have. The problem is that we are not well equipped for certain temperature. After certain temperature, we die. Plus, climate change also creates natural disasters, which also kill humans. So it is our problem. So the framing is very important, because we said the planet, we're destroying the planet. Well, it sounds really abstract, poor planet, but not my problem. As opposed to, we are all going to die. Well, I'm part of that community that's going to die, right? So might be better to do something about it. The second thing that we are trying to understand and to see how we can embed this in people is that politicians are not, and then necessarily, the enemy in all of this, right? Politicians are usually very responsive to people, and if there is sufficient social demand for some issue, it's very likely that politicians will do something just because it is profitable on political terms. They are going to win votes, people is going to be happy with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have found in surveys is that people is not really aiming at doing something about climate change. It's like a politically polite thing, saying, yes, I want to save the planet, I'm going to behave, blah, 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 blah. But acting is a different thing, and that's where we just don't act sufficiently. So we're trying to figure out that, how to do that, and how to get this as a really important thing to people. Then I'm running short of time, so I'm going to go to the second one, which is hope. And hope, we believe that hope is a very useful either substitute or complement to stick and carrots, to this traditional approach on taxes and subsidies. And this is very much related to the idea of the notion of the good life, and it's how do we create narratives, utopias, that are sufficiently attractive for people, for thinking not only that the end point is desirable, there is a nice place to be in a planet without climate change or with not so much climate change, but also that the path to that goal is also desirable. It's not necessarily a sacrifice, changing your car for a bike or changing your car for public transportation. That's also part of this idea of the good life. And how can we do that? And hope also gives agency to people. It gives people the notion that the future actually depends on them, not on somebody else, not on the government, not on others, but also on them. And that's part of what we're trying to do. Information is quite relevant in all of this that has to do with hope. And the way we think, just to close this, we are thinking about this, linking the local with hope, is successful cases. And successful cases that are close to me. If you think of some of the great policies that have been very successful, for instance, recycling or reducing the use of plastic bags, they all started very local in specific cities, and then other cities mimic what these cities were doing, and now is worldwide a good example for what can be done. And it has to do something that I'm related to. It doesn't have to be Sweden or Norway, because it's too far away from, especially from developing countries. It has to do something quite local. So it's like planting seeds here and there, and we think that this can spread further. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to ask Robin to step up.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful conference this is. I've been asked at very short notice to contribute, partly I think because of the discussion yesterday. José Garibaldi has said we need to tell stories. We need to bring these technical instrumental issues alive, and nowhere is this more true than of climate change. So I want to tell a story. And the story is about what happened yesterday afternoon in my, when I asked a question to the panel here. And I want to, it was an exchange with David Pan and with Richard Beardsworth. It was during Richard's talk about climate change and Maurice Glassman. And I'd just like to, because I take part in a lot of discussions about these issues, and it was a cameo, and it may help bring alive what the predicament we're in is about. So let me just try this and summarize. The fundamental point is that the politics, the predicament we are in about climate change is a political predicament as well as a technical one. And yesterday, Richard Beardsworth, sitting here, told us about the processes of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the COP processes, which have flowed since 1992 from the knowledge being generated by the Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change, wrestling with the hypothesis, and it was then a hypothesis, of climate change, anthropogenic climate change, posing a real serious danger to humanity. And that process began, as I say, in the early 90s, and those processes, to my mind, were a really remarkable, a unique achievement of international diplomacy and geopolitical negotiation, and have resulted in a combination of the world's scientists and governments devising a complex process resulting in a succession of reports about an issue where knowledge was developing. So starting from a very low knowledge base, the ambition was to grow our knowledge and to develop policies simultaneously. Now, Richard outlined some of what has gone on and the dynamics of these processes, the way that the policy and scientific worlds have been producing scenarios and better and better informed scenarios in scientific terms. But he also pointed out how the COP processes are really not delivering, and we've just heard this from my fellow speakers up here, that progress is far, far too slow, and that the obstacles are becoming greater. And after Richard had spoken, then Maurice Glassman, basically, in response to him, pointed to particularly Germany as a case where these issues, which of course affect energy policy fundamentally, had resulted in all kinds of political difficulties and indeed are highly problematic for German industry and indeed for the shape of the industrial economy of Germany overall. So Richard and Maurice had both made these interventions very, very eloquently. My question was simply to endorse what Richard was saying from my own, as it were, perspective, and I expressed, and I think I said, astonishment at the lack of acknowledgement of what to me is a vitally serious problem by it not being given a weight commensurate with its importance by Maurice. And I pointed out that, forgive me, that as it were, not taking this problem seriously and giving an enormous, our failure to achieve this is resulting in enormous difficulties, increasingly manifested in climate events. And but we're divided on this. And David Pan, and I hope you'll forgive me paraphrasing him, said effectively that I was exaggerating, that, as it were, the framing I was offering was apocalyptic, and that the science was still so fundamentally underdetermined that predictions could not be relied upon. And I'm not quite sure what the implication of that was, other than wait and see, that we don't need to an injection of new urgency is not so important. Thank you so much. At that, the next intervention on this, so that was David, Richard then, from here, responded from his knowledge of the activities of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, its reports and so on. And I think rightly, showed that actually the track record is very powerful, that the forecasts or the predictions that resulting from these IPCC COP processes are being vindicated by events. They are happening almost as predicted. And the seriousness of the weather events and the steadily more alarming or rather more pressing prescriptions to governments that are being urged by the IPCC are reflections of precisely this. But the point is that, yes, there are huge uncertainties. There's constant new feedbacks being discovered. But nevertheless, the underlying trend is that the events are unfolding as predicted. Okay, thank you very much. And of course, and then latterly, finally rounding off Morris, Glassman, hardly able to conceal his distaste for people like me, said that this was too apocalyptic. Now, my point here is, this is the predicament we're in. There are people like me, and there are people, forgive me, David, like David and Morris. And there are huge interests involved in this. And the logjam that is occurring is a reflection of this. I find this in my talks. There is little political purchase in as it were, campaigning about climate or in alerting more concern about climate. So there are many, I could go on at great length about why I think inherently the situation has become that there are some of us who see the glass as half empty and others who see it half full. Just to extend that image, I just say, if we picture two glasses, both half full, and one of them is the half empty one, and the other is the half full one, it's the half full one that is being added to by events as we are experiencing around the world. So we face, to my view, a tremendous political predicament because we have not got agreement on this, and this is going to be vital for any post-liberal politics. Thank you.
And the final speaker for this afternoon's panel, Tobias Phibbs.
Thank you very much. And I fear I'm going to lower the tone slightly after that, so apologies, Robin. I'm also going to begin by returning to the subject of Ian's presentation, which is demography. One of the difficulties of preparing for this panel was the three nouns and knowing which to pick each such fun subjects. So I'm going to try and do a bit of demography and then push back a little bit on what some of the others have said, hopefully in a comradely way, on nature. I also feel I should apologise to Adrian, because I think I was invited somewhat under false pretenses, because I wrote something and did a piece of work, and I've now actually changed my mind on that. So if I say the wrong thing, I'm very sorry. So before we get to nature, on family formation and total fertility rate, which strike me as possibly not the right words we should use if we want to make people want to make babies. I think the argument, the post-liberal argument for why people don't have babies flows from the wider post-liberal critique as outlined over the last 10 years or so, which, roughly speaking, is that some combination of liberalism, the free market and the Enlightenment freed us from arbitrary social ties and social bonds and conventions. But in liberating ourselves from those bonds, those given bonds, We lost the ties that bound us together, the things that allowed us to be fully human beings, with attachments and a sense of belonging. Our culture was said, and still is by post-liberals, said to be about expression without limits, freedom beyond all boundaries. In fact, freedom unconstrained by morality or ethics, unconstrained by the material world, even unconstrained in the case of transhumanism by our own physical bodies. I think that the case of fertility and why it's so low demonstrates that this is not an accurate description of our culture and is almost the opposite of an accurate description of our culture. I think our culture is not expansive, it is not limitless, it's the opposite. It's neurotic and it's fearful, it's conformist and it's stiff. And this is why there are no babies. People are scared to cross thresholds from which they cannot uncross themselves. There is no thing more terrifying and more limitless, borderless, boundless, and so on, to modern man, myself included, than the prospect of lifelong love and creating new life. It's a totally terrifying, cosmic, adventurous, frightening thing to do. It's not some conservative thing at all. The Korean-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who I think is fantastic, wrote that today's ego, with its endless capacity to enunciate and refine criteria in mate selection, does not desire at all. Love today, he went on, is meant to be a kind of wholly benign, cozy, comfy thing. It no longer represents plot, he writes, narration or drama, only inconsequential emotion and arousal. Think of the language we use, for example, traditionally with love, falling, crashing, abandonment. These aren't nice, benign words at all. They're kind of shocking. And so my view is that it's conservative fear, not a kind of boundless libidinal freedom, that defines our culture. And this is particularly true among the young, and this is a major cause of why people aren't having very many babies. And think, too, of something like polyamory, which is taken to be an emblematic of hyper-progressive, hyper-liberal culture, gone mad, my God, no one has any limits anymore, the poor children. I don't know if people know anyone who's polyamorous. All it is about rules and process. It's love as dictated by a human resources committee. And it's the total surrender of intimacy to bureaucracy and process. It's exhausting, it's knackering. As you say, it's awful. So I think the question is what Baudrillard asked a while ago, which is, what happens after the orgy? What do we do with each other then? And the answer seems to be kind of a lot of hand-holding and conversations about limits, in fact, and a lot of conversations about wellness and how we need to kind of look after ourselves. And in that context, the idea of having babies and doing something so profound and so dramatic is absolutely terrifying. And on the one hand, what I'm saying is quite abstract, but I think you can apply it practically too. Parents now spend more time looking after their kids than at any time previously, certainly more than they did in the 1950s, the kind of traditional conservative time. Again, if you know young parents, and it's just so great, but the temperature has to be 19.25 degrees at all times, like everything is manicured and controlled, and so the prospect of having kids, because we have this intense conservatism in our culture, becomes more and more terrifying. So that's the first thing I want to say, is a slight kind of pushback maybe on some of the conventional post-liberal wisdom on limits and fertility. Have I got time to speak briefly about nature too? Great, okay. Great. So a few years ago, and I think this is why I was asked to speak, I did a piece of work on climate change and nature, and it essentially began with an acknowledgement of three problems, which at the time I thought were one problem, and now I think are three problems. And broadly speaking, they were climate change itself, firstly. Secondly, a growing resistance to a progressive, statist, hectoring form of climate change policy, and the sense was that this was putting people off, and the yellow vests and so on was happening at the time. There was opposition to low traffic neighbourhoods in London, so this was part of the context. And then thirdly, and this really is what José and Vidal and others have touched on, a wider crisis of meaning, a sense that we'd become disenchanted and then somehow lost our connection with nature and the natural rhythms of life, and we'd lost a sense of who we are as human beings. I still think these are three problems, but I kind of created a kind of neat and elegant narrative in which they all aligned, and there was some lovely green, natural, popular solution. But I think, like most neat and elegant solutions, it was basically wrong. So I thought a green politics should start with Weber, and what he borrowed from the German Romantics, which was this idea that before the Enlightenment, we lived in a great enchanted garden in which our worlds were defined by a direct and unmediated relationship with nature. And then the Enlightenment came along, and magic, tradition, and effect were supplanted by instrumentalism and rationalism, and along the way we lost a sense of who we were. I then saw lockdown as an intensification of this disenchantment. We acquiesced willingly, actually, we gladly gave ourselves to bare life, to life mediated by screens and apps. Marc Augé, the anthropologist, talked about non-places, hotels and airports, which are textureless and undifferentiated. And I thought lockdown was a kind of non-life, the end point of progressive disenchantment. And I wanted to kind of tie this all together in some neat and cozy narrative. And it was, you know, it was quite neat and cozy. But the trouble with it is, and it is a problem, is that this stuff has basically nothing to do with greenhouse gas emissions. And I tried kind of tying it together. So, you know, the real problem is the fact that we don't countenance limits. We don't countenance limits in relation to our consumption, our production, and we also don't countenance limits in relationship to our own personal bodies and our own personal relationship with nature. And again, that's all very well and good, but it's going to do precisely nothing to actually combat climate change. So I've reluctantly concluded, thank you, that climate change is, in fact, not a spiritual crisis at all, but a technical problem with technical solutions. Insofar as Britain can play a role in those technical solutions, it's something like a combination of planning reform and state action so that we can produce much cleaner energy, particularly nuclear. I'll defer to others on the specifics, but you get the idea. How post-liberal this all is, I've no idea, and it's actually quite dull and doesn't really fit into any nice narrative at all. But it does seem to have the distinction of actually being true. This doesn't mean we should ignore questions about the good life or disenchantment or move away from making normative claims about substantive forms of living and how we might live better together. But there is a danger that we become like the hectoring progressives who we set out in opposition against, who say that we can't do X without Y. So you can't, I don't know, you can't bring the bee population back without dismantling American imperialism or something. And there's a danger that we kind of say you can't address the technical problem of climate change without fundamentally opposing liberal anthropology. And it makes for a nice article, but it's actually not true. So I'll finish now by paraphrasing the great Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who criticized the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat very aptly in the mid-19th century by saying when the people are being beaten by a stick, they're not much happier if it is called the people's stick. And I'd say we should be pretty careful before we pick up like the post-liberal stick, because they weren't like that either. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, panelists, for making quite a bit out of pursuing the good life, nature, demography, and politics. Before I open it to questions, I guess I've taken a few notes and tried to string together a narrative here, and we began with a presentation which spoke about lack of meaning and purpose among young people, and as a tenured radical that has suffered a few blows in the last few days, I would like to say that I do regularly confront classrooms full of young people who have no meaning in their lives and who feel that there is no future, whether that's attached to climate crisis apocalypticism or not, I don't know, but I think it has something more to do with this and the lack of solitude, and also the lack of practice with boredom. Kids just aren't bored anymore. You sit on a bus and, sit on a train or whatnot, and people are continually distracted. You give a lecture, as a tenured radical does, and you walk up and down the aisles, and they're so distracted that they can't see that when you're walking up and down the aisles, you're looking at what they're looking at on the screens, and rather than listening to me discourse on Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes or Locke, they are looking at kittens and puppies and complete and utter nonsense. I kid you not. This is a very depressing prospect, and I think that, as Vidal pointed out, meaning is something that grows out of community and out of place and out of a feeling of belonging. And if this extracts anything, it's a feeling of belonging. Yes, the objectives are known, measurable, orderable, predictable, and controllable, to put it in Weberian terms. But if people don't feel ownership of the outcome, as Vidal put it, I think that the prospects for the future are quite terrifying. As José put it, we need to talk in terms of place and community rather than carbon dioxide tonnes per year or per vehicle, or carbon footprint, notoriously an idea sponsored by Shell Oil, or maybe it was BP. So I really think that there is a coherence to this panel. Robin spoke eloquently in defence, I believe, of the robustness of scientific knowledge of climate-induced, of human-induced climate change, and I think that there is a deep existential problem there that we confront, which is that the science is robust, and the IPCC is one of the most conservative organisations on earth in the way that conservative professional organisations on earth in the way that it develops its findings. The apocalypticism, on the other hand, it needs to be thought of as socially induced, as a tenured radical, again, I would say, as a problem of class. And the apocalypticism it can only be strengthened when some of us are flying to Mars and others of us are sleeping on street corners. So we could have a situation where the climate problem is solved and there are solar panels on every rooftop, and people sleeping on every street corner. And I think that this is the kind of apocalypticism that needs to be undone, and it can be undone not by polyamory, but by embracing some of the things that were spoken about by José and Vidal and speakers on the previous panel, who Paul Kingsnorth and so forth, trying to get to a point where life once more has meaning. So I'd better shut up there. Let's take some questions from the audience. Let's have a few. Okay, so I saw Adrian's hand first, man in the peach sweater second, blue blazer and white black singlet. So one. Do we have a microphone assistant, or shall I?
Thank you, Alison. Thank you all very, very much indeed. I really enjoyed that. I had a question for Tobias, but others may want to come in on it, which is, I really found that the way that you tried to capture and conceptualize where we are, very, very interesting, that our culture is neurotic and fearful, and it's actually the opposite of this sort of limitless, quest for total and utter autonomy. But I wonder whether that culture now is in part a backlash against the ideology of limitless emancipation, autonomy, and so on. So are we seeing, in cultural terms, the sort of backlash that we're also seeing in political terms when it comes to populism? That populism is this huge blowback against, a number of liberal, progressive policies that haven't worked. Now, I'm not saying that it's a perfect analogy, but I do wonder whether there's something in that young people are, sort of in some inchoate way, reacting against the culture of the 60s, right, to put it somewhat simply. So that was one question, and connected with that is this idea that actually neither that culture that we've inherited from the 60s, reinforced by the economics of the 80s, has in any way provided people with stability or meaning or sense, which is why there is still this void. It's not a nihilism in the sense of a 19th century type ideology, but there is this kind of void. And then, of course, there's always voids, whether in nature or in politics or in culture, they're filled by the worst extremes. So that, in a way, one could tell the story that you've told very well, Tobias, without necessarily excluding the idea that we still have an ideology of autonomy that is very, very destructive.
So let's take those 4 questions. There's the peach. Peach blazer. Apologies.
Thank you. One for you, Robin, I think. Quite personal. I have a apocalyptic, hectoring, Just Stop Oil supporting daughter who's been arrested twice this year for protests. I know. Well, actually, I think it might be Richard's fault because she's a lead student who believes life is pointless. What are you going to advise her?
Well, just could let's move. Let's just take the other 2 questions, because I'm sure that many of us can respond or maybe not respond. Blue blazer, black singlet.
Thank you. So just slightly building on Adrian's question and also slightly pushing back against the suggestion, I just wanted to suggest that perhaps this dynamic that on the one side young people have no sense of meaning in life, they're not having children because they don't have a sense of roots or continuing anything great. And on the other side, there's this perhaps risk-averse culture, bureaucratic culture, the highly regulated character of polyamory and so forth. But maybe there's some sense in which actually, just as liberalism tends to inexorably expand both the state and the market in a mutually reinforcing process, there's a dynamic here where the destruction of traditional norms surrounding reproduction has then required their substitution by a more bureaucratic, more formalized, more regulated system. And so perhaps these 2 phenomena are, in some respects, 2 sides of the same coin.
Hi there, great panel. My question is about something which I think is a thread on the panel here, and it's about the politics of care. And I'm especially asking an all-male panel about this, particularly because my point is, how do you make this appealing to men? We've heard a lot this morning about how difficult, we're not having enough babies and stuff. I think a lot of women know that, and and I don't want just mean to say this is all about the bad side of the domestic space. Actually, I think men do gain a lot from obviously their experience of fatherhood, their experiences in the home, all these things, and yet we hear a lot of talk about it, and yet we don't seem to be see much shifting. So my question is, what feels attractive to men? And I would point to the pandemic as a really interesting moment with that, because you saw the visibility of care happening. For example, fathers were able to show their kids on camera. I think that was all quite important with this public-private breakdown I spoke about yesterday with the settlement, which was 130 years ago, right? We're still talking about this divide. But my question is how you then show, at the same time, 7% of people, straight couples, share the household labour equally. So it is also still a burden. Women have entered the public space much more, you see. But men have not entered the private space in precisely the same way. My question is to you all, why do you think that is, and how do we make it attractive?
Well, I'm glad I have a panel here to respond to those questions. Okay, so we have some stuff here from...
It's directed at Tobias. I'll respond to Tobias as well. But you go first? Okay. So young men seem to be uniquely afflicted with some of this lack of meaning that we're talking about. They're dropping out of mainstream life at incredible numbers. You know all the stats about how young women are outperforming young men at work and at school and all this. So, there's one thesis here that maybe that's, they're hyper-conservative, they're pulling away because it's too difficult to go to college, too difficult to go to work, and we're circling the wagons. I would suggest that it's more a lack of pull factors, a lack of attraction, than a sort of repulsion at the difficulty of it. And I say that because young men, at least in the United States, are on a really manic search for meaning right now. So for the first time since we've started collecting data, young men are going to church more than young women are. This has never happened before. So young men are flocking to online gurus who give them extremely rigorous instructions on how to live a life, right? Like they're adopting, super difficult nutritional regimes, workout regimes. And I think that given something to chase after, young men will chase, right? And I think that my industry, our industry of academia, has not made a case that there's anything really good and beautiful to be gained there. And I think a lot of people have become alienated from it. And for whatever set of reasons, nature or nurture, it seems like young women are more willing to keep the ship going, right? To keep doing what one is supposed to do in a society like ours, and young men are more likely to drop out. But I totally see the risk aversion you're talking about. It's endemic. But I'd love to hear more, Tobias, on how you're differentiating a lack of pull factors from the push factors that you were suggesting.
Is this one on? Yeah. I agree with everything you said, and most of the comments as well made by the audience. I think very briefly on the young men point. If in some way having children could be seen for what presumably it is, which is like an enormous, extraordinary, dangerous, adventurous, exciting thing to do, that'd be no bad thing. Adrian, yeah, I think it is a response, but it's not a new response. Like Baudrillard, the orgy was over after the 60s and 70s. I don't think we've had a hugely wild, libidinally free culture since then. Certainly not in my lifetime. Alas. I'm trying to conceptualize something which I've been thinking about for ages and still haven't written, called the wholesome turn, which I think begins in about 2008, more specifically. And here you find, particularly among the young liberal middle class in Britain, I can't speak for anywhere else, and their politics will remain completely progressive, left liberal. It's not deviation on points like that. But what they're interested in doing is wild swimming, cooking. Wild swimming is just swimming in a river, it turns out. Very disappointing. And then, baking. Domesticity is back. Baking, folk music. There's a new folk revival. There's totally a bedding in. There's a parochialism. There's an embrace of small businesses. I mean, if you want a kind of post-liberal parochial utopia in which people know their neighbours in a building community, just go to Stoke Newington in Hackney.
I will add from a different perspective, but we commissioned a survey, part of the team commissioned a survey of what happened if you decarbonize sectors in the region. Those were most affected were young men between 24 and 30-something in Latin America. So they will be the largest group becoming jobless. So it's also something to consider. What happens if you don't consider replacement? This element is about the just transition aspect that needs to be addressed. That's one point. And then Tobias said that it had to be a technical solution and that we do not need to think, or maybe that point was technical, not so much. But I did not say that, and I did not say that we should replace this discussion with a technical one. What we are doing is, and again, this is not, not again the UK, this is something that the UK, Japan, and a number of others started doing in the 2007, 2006, trying to imagine if you want to really know whether it's possible or not to live with very low emissions. The first way in which this thing was made was trying to imagine a future, imagine a society in the future, model the emissions of that future, then capture the carbon footprint, the carbon trajectory from there to the present, and you calculate the carbon budget that you have to get there. If you do it from the present towards the future, instead of backcasting, your degrees of liberties are far lower. So following a purely technical perspective is better to have a kind of a better story to tell and see how do you do that, and then calculate that, rather start from the calculation and then try to tell the story. Because numbers do not allow to provide a highly nuanced idea of what you want. And furthermore, if you want to discuss with people who are not technical, then you cannot, if you only have numbers, you have to have numbers and stories. Now, in the case of Mexico, for instance, the first iteration of this process resulted that the number of, if you delayed and if you had to then the cost in terms of carbon pricing and carbon taxes was so high that it would not work. So you had to start doing more activities at different levels, and then also, well, it will become worse the more you delay action. And then we started thinking, what happens if you introduce taxes? What happens if you introduce more public goods? How do you include the public goods? And then we started drawing visions of specific places. But this has to have a dialogue between the technical and numerical and the qualitative and descriptive. And again, as Paul Kingsnorth was saying before, it is something that goes beyond the machine. It's something that you need to, there's also a spiritual element in this. And we need to give space for that spirit. I'm not saying that there's not a technical element. Of course there is. And of course there is a quantitative aspect. But it's not all there is in this thing.
Thank you. I'm very interested in what others have said, and I'll only respond to my friend in the peat. Yes, but I was only, I wasn't joking when I say I avoid these conversations. I avoid them with my own children who are in their 30s and 40s and who are all leading very productive, I think, socially engaged lives. But I don't share with them my apprehensions about the climate question. And I don't know if this is a pathology of mine. Perhaps it is, but it's certainly become more, I have felt this more acutely reading what is going on, but also since I stopped having agency. And I think that my answer to your daughter would be, you know, get involved in something. You know, hey, there we are. Okay, good. Yeah, okay. Solve another problem.
I just would like to call attention to the final question there. Yeah. I'm just. Does the panel want to speak to this issue of women and this issue? Give me a shovel. I will just keep digging the hole here. Oh boy. No, it's well taken. Well taken. Mea culpa. Does somebody else want to say something intelligent?
Not really, but. So is your question about men going into the caring professions or caring for their children at home or washing the dishes?
Yeah.
Which one?
Well, I mean, both and, but the politics of care feels so crucial to this question of climate, to this question of nature, but it is gendered. It is still gendered, and I'm not a biological essentialist about this. I'm just saying women feel that it is gendered. I don't want to speak for all women, but when I speak to the other women my age, anecdotally, we feel that it's still gendered, and we feel that men don't feel, when they get it, loads of men want to spend more time at home with their kids, right? They desperately want that, you know, in theory, but we don't have the status or money or incentives or political narrative around that to attract them to it. And so I'm interested in how does that grow, and I think what a lot of you were saying, Jose, was extremely germane to that. So.
To come with this idea of a good life and how do you get there, it was not something that we developed on our own. We started asking people. We said at the beginning, how would you like to live? And we went in different countries, and then we made these iterations trying to find out. And then in South Africa, curiously enough, and then we produced narratives. What will it look like to live in that place? And then how does it look like how did you get there? The South African narrative was an economy of care. It was not designed like that. We never thought that we will create an economy of care, nor we tried to improve an economy of care, but it emerged as an economy of care. So the South Africa team was imagining a future in 2050 in which most of the activities were along the lines of an economy of care. And since we couldn't know what to do, we said that this was a public affluence narrative. So life in the public realm that was shared was significantly improved. Curiously enough, this is not a technological hardware stuff, which of course you need to achieve these things, but it was a kind of software how do people live was the important thing. And then they started imagining different things of how people live in specific places. There were communities, there were different ways of arranging household things, different ways of understanding food, transport, etc. But it was an economy of care, and I think that is an important aspect of curiously enough, it was developed by women, not by the males in the team.
Further questions? David? Yellow? So David Penn first, and then the football shirt. And maybe there was a question here. Sir? Did you have your hand up? Okay, final round. Okay, up the top with the white blazer.
So I did want to address Robin's comments because my objection was not so much about the predictions about the number of degrees of change in the climate, right? But about the predictions about catastrophic events that would impact people's lives in the future based on a certain number of degrees of change in the climate. That has not really been demonstrated. And the difficulty is, because that's not been demonstrated, but yet the climate lobby emphasizes those sort of catastrophic events in the future, it leads to a general kind of on the part of I think the broader population, a tendency to discount the veracity, I guess even the ingenuousness, right, of what's being sold through the whole climate discussion, right? And that seems to be the problem, and it's a problem. I don't think it's a problem of the people who are skeptical, but it really is, I think it's a problem of the people that are trying to create some kind of change in climate policy. Because, to me, it's a part of a kind of, it's a problem of liberalism, because it's a problem of experts and specialists trying to decide things for the rest of the population. This is the problem that I see post-liberalism is trying to address, right? But yet this is a continuation of that same process. And so, I spoke to Richard afterwards, and one of the things that I think that needs to be emphasized in terms of climate policy because of the political realities is that it really has to be based on sort of nation-state solutions on an individual nation-state basis. It can't, by trying to turn it into this international process, it totally delegitimizes the process. It has to be focused on nation-state processes. It has to be focused on market-based processes. So I think one of the big things that came out of this, I don't know if you know the Science article that came out was a couple months ago, that emphasizes that carbon taxes are essential for any type of climate solution that would have any real bearing, because it would focus on market-based solutions. So anyway, but I'm not opposed to the very idea of trying to address climate change, but I think that it really needs to be done in a way that supports low-cost energy at the same time that it tries to reach some kind of climate goals.
I would just like to say that yes, I have been urged very strongly to end the panel very quickly. Some very fine words there from David, and correcting a misunderstanding. Oh, the afflicted young men. Well,
yeah. Okay. Quick question.
You're going to do it anyway.
Quick question. I think it starts aimed at Tobias, but I think kind of goes generally to the panelists and maybe the conference. Let's assume you're right, and the questions of meaning and the questions of climate technically are separate, and you can fix the climate issue without improving the quality of anyone's life. The question is, why would you separate them? So if you could improve someone's life and fix climate, or you could not improve someone's life and fix climate, why would you pick that separation? And I kind of mean that generally, because I think it goes on to the point generally that, we've heard a lot of different political discussions here of trade unions, of taxes, of energy, and I think that one of the points to consider is if the good life isn't the point, if improving the quality of life isn't the point, what is? So my question is, let's say you could separate the quality of life with climate. My question is, why would you?
You can do both, but you might do them separately. Nuclear power isn't necessarily going to improve your life in terms of it being more meaningful and rich, but it will solve climate change.